All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something, something pretty wild, a real curveball in how we think about the world, the Black Swan.
Ah, the Black Swan.
Yeah, and we have Nassim Taleb to thank for
Yeah.
really putting this concept on the map. The way he describes it, a Black Swan event, it's something so improbable.
Right.
It comes out of nowhere, has a massive impact, and then only after it happens, only then do we scramble to explain it, try to make it fit into our neat little worldview as if it were predictable all along.
Oh, absolutely. It's like we hate to admit we were caught off guard.
It's like our brains just can't handle the chaos.
Yeah, we need that sense of order.
We need a story. So you think it's something like, I don't know, Google. I mean, who could have predicted that kind of meteoric rise?
Right, out of nowhere.
Or, on the flip side, you have something like 9/11, a tragedy that changed everything. Textbook Black Swans, both of them.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you've brought in some excerpts from Taleb's book, The Black Swan, which is really the seminal work on this.
Definitely a must-read.
And our goal here is to, get into the nitty-gritty of this idea for you, really unpack it. We want to understand how these unforeseen high-impact events shape our history, how they drive innovation in ways we never expected, and even how they play out in your own life.
Right.
But even more importantly, I think, we want to explore why we as humans seem to have such a hard time accepting that these things, these black swans, are even possible before they hit us right between the eyes.
It's true. It's like we have blinders on. Okay, so let's dive into Taleb's book. One of the central points he makes, and it's a bit unsettling, is that we're fundamentally blind to randomness. Especially, those really big deviations, the outliers, the stuff that really shifts the game. And it makes you wonder, right? Why are we so focused on the little things, the everyday news cycle, and we completely miss the signals of these potential seismic shifts that are brewing under the surface?
It's a good question, isn't it? Like, where is our attention really going?
Taleb even asks, and this is pretty thought-provoking, he asks if constantly reading the newspaper, with its focus on the immediate, often pretty insignificant stuff, if that actually makes us less knowledgeable about the world in the long run.
Yeah, less able to see the big picture, maybe.
Exactly, like we're getting lost in the noise.
Yeah. And I think to sort of connect this to the bigger picture for you, Taleb gives us this really useful distinction between what he calls Mediocristan and Extremistan.
Right. These are like two different worlds, two different ways that things play out.
Exactly. So think about Mediocristan like this. Imagine you're measuring the height of a large group of people.
Okay.
You'll get a pretty solid average height, right? And even the tallest person or the shortest person, they're not going to dramatically shift that average.
Right.
Things in Mediocristan events, they're kind of bounded, predictable. You can have a decent idea of what to expect.
So, like, you can take a small sample and get a good idea of the whole picture, right?
Okay.
But then you step into Extremistan. And here, the rules are totally different. Here, a single event can have a disproportionate impact. It could totally rewrite the rules of the game.
Right. It's like, think about book sales.
Okay.
So you have J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, right, selling hundreds of millions of copies. That one phenomenon completely dwarfs the sales of most other books.
It's an outlier.
It's a total outlier, right? Or think about stock market crashes. One day, a single day, can wipe out fortunes. So for you, listening, the crucial difference is this. How does knowledge work in these two domains? In Mediocristan, as we said, a small sample, it gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on.
Right.
But in Extremistan, no way. You can't do that. Black swans, by their very nature, they're rare, and they have this huge impact.
They're the exceptions that make the rule meaningless.
Exactly. So if you're only looking at past data in Extremistan, and you're not accounting for these wild outlier events, it can be really misleading for making decisions. You could be looking at the first 100 days or even the first 1,000 days and have no clue that a black swan is about to come along and change everything.
Right. So let's talk about the Black Swan itself. Taleb lays out 3 key characteristics.
Yeah.
The first one, it's unpredictable. You can't see it coming based on what you already know. Second, it has a massive impact. It fundamentally alters the course of events. And third, and this is where our brains get tricky, after it happens, we come up with an explanation, a narrative that makes it seem obvious in retrospect. Like, oh, of course it had to happen. But in reality, it was never that predictable.
Yeah, we're really good at telling ourselves stories.
We need to make sense of it.
We do. And what's also important for you to keep in mind, as Taleb points out, is that even the non-occurrence of an event can be a black swan.
Whoa, okay. Explain that one.
So imagine everyone is predicting an economic collapse.
Right.
It's all over the news, everyone's bracing for impact, but then it doesn't happen.
Okay.
That non-event, the fact that the expected collapse didn't materialize, that can also be a black swan. It can have ripple effects that nobody anticipated.
It's like a phantom black swan, the dog that didn't bark.
Ah.
I like that. Okay,
Yeah.
so now Taleb introduces these two ideas that I think are really key to understanding this whole thing. Platonicity and the Platonic fold. Platonicity, as I understand it, it's basically our tendency as humans to believe that we understand the world way better than we actually do. We create these mental models, these categories,
Yeah.
and we think they perfectly capture reality.
Right. It's like we want to put everything in neat little boxes.
We want to simplify things, make them make sense.
Yeah, we create these perfect representations in our minds, these Platonic forms.
Right. And the danger is, as Taleb points out, we don't always know where these models are going to fail us.
And they will fail, especially in Extremistan.
Right. And when they do, the consequences can be huge.
Absolutely. The models that are supposed to help us understand the world, they can actually blind us to the very events we need to be prepared for. Like, imagine a medicine that works great for most people, but for a small percentage, it has really bad side effects.
Okay.
Those side effects, that's the black swan.
So the Platonic fold, this is where our neat little models, our simplified maps of reality, they run up against the actual messy, unpredictable world. And that's where black swans are born. It's that gap between what we think we know and what's actually true.
Yeah, it's a dangerous gap. And Taleb gives this great example. He talks about the filmmaker Luchino Visconti. You familiar with him?
Vaguely, yeah. Italian, right?
Yeah, a famous director. Apparently, he was so meticulous that even when you had these closed boxes on his film sets, just props, meant to look like they held jewels, he insisted they actually have real jewels inside.
Wow.
Right. Not just for the actors, to make their performances more authentic, but it was about this deeper sense of integrity. Like, he refused to have a false representation on his set.
It's interesting. It speaks to our desire for authenticity, for things to be what we think they are.
Exactly. And sometimes that desire can actually be misleading, especially when it comes to the models we use to understand the world.
This all leads into another one of Taleb's big ideas, and this one really hit home for me. The narrative fallacy.
The narrative fallacy, yeah.
It's this deep-seated human need to create stories, to weave narratives around events, especially those big, impactful ones, the black swans.
Right. We want a story, a beginning, middle, and end.
We want to make sense of things. So we overinterpret, we try to force cause and effect relationships where they might not even exist. And it's all in service of creating a good story, something that's easy to understand, easy to remember.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, it's important to realize this. We'll take a simple, easy-to-digest story over the messy, chaotic truth any day.
A clean narrative versus the random reality.
Right. Our brains are wired for pattern recognition. And sometimes that gets us into trouble. Taleb even talks about the biology of this, like the different roles of the brain's hemispheres.
Oh, right. The left brain, right brain stuff.
Yeah. So the left hemisphere, the one often linked to language, to logic, it's really good at finding patterns, even if they're not really there. The right hemisphere, though, it's more attuned to novelty, to individual facts, things that don't fit neatly into a pattern.
And this need for narrative, it's not just some psychological quirk, right? It's got practical implications.
Oh, for sure.
Like Taleb brings up something called Andrei Nikolaevich's rule.
Right.
Which basically says that it costs us something, in terms of energy, brain power, to store and retrieve information that isn't organized. It doesn't fit a pattern. It's inefficient.
Exactly. It makes sense, right? A well-structured narrative, a good story, it's much easier for our brains to handle than a jumble of random facts. Like, we're always looking for ways to compress information to make it more manageable.
So this has a big impact on how we remember things, on how we understand the past.
Absolutely.
Our memories, they're not like video recordings, right?
No.
They're constantly being rewritten, edited in light of what happens after the event.
Yeah, our memories shift to fit the narrative we create. And for you, the scary part is that we can even invent memories.
Whoa, that is scary. Especially when you think about, legal cases, eyewitness testimony.
It has big implications.
It's disturbing to think about how malleable our memories can be. And what's even more concerning, Taleb points out that even science, which we think of as being, objective, rigorous, Even science isn't immune to the narrative fallacy.
Yeah. Scientists are human too. They get caught up in the stories as well.
He talks about how empirical research shows that scientists, they're more likely to be swayed by a paper with a sensational title, something that tells a good story, even if the actual findings aren't that strong.
Makes you question everything you read, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Okay, so to really hammer home this point about, the power of a good story, Taleb gives this great example of an insurance salesman on a plane.
Oh, I remember this one.
So this guy, he's sitting next to Taleb, and he starts talking about how his cousin knows someone who was mugged and murdered in Central Park.
Right. A very specific, very vivid story.
Yeah. And the way he tells it, it's so detailed, so emotionally charged that you almost can't help but believe it, even though statistically, the chances of that happening to you are incredibly slim.
Yeah. But we tend to trust a personal anecdote more than abstract statistics.
We do. We do. It feels more real. And it's this tendency that leads us to add unnecessary details to our explanations, to make them more convincing, even if those details actually make them less likely to be true.
Right, and that's where things get really tricky.
Taleb gives another example. I think it was from E.M. Thorster. The statement, Joey seemed happily married. He killed his wife.
Okay.
That's actually statistically more probable than Joey seemed happily married. He killed his wife to get her inheritance.
Oh, I see.
Because the first statement, it allows for a wider range of possibilities. You don't know why he killed his wife, so it could be any number of reasons. But the second statement, it narrows it down. It gives you a specific motive. And by doing so, it actually makes the statement statistically less likely.
So the more details we add, the less probable it becomes.
Sometimes, yeah, it's counterintuitive. But it highlights the danger of getting too attached to a specific narrative, even when it seems to make sense.
So what's the antidote to this, this narrative fallacy? How do we avoid this trap?
Taleb has some pretty straightforward advice. Focus on experimentation over storytelling.
Okay.
Value firsthand experience over just reading about things in history books. And trust what you've learned through actual practice, clinical knowledge over abstract theories.
Get your hands dirty.
Yeah. Don't just take someone's word for it.
Makes sense.
Okay, so now we get to another really fascinating concept, and this one's a bit of a mind bender. The problem of silent evidence.
Ah, yes. Silent evidence.
What exactly is silent evidence, and why is it so important for understanding black swans?
So silent evidence is basically all the information that's missing, the data that we don't see. And this missing information can really distort our understanding of the world.
Okay.
Taleb uses a great example, and it's a really old one, the story of the drowned worshippers. Imagine a group of people caught in a shipwreck. Some of them pray to a certain god for deliverance, and they survive.
Okay.
So they attribute their survival to their prayers. But what about all the people who also prayed, but who drowned? We never hear their stories. Their evidence is silent. It's not part of the narrative.
Right. It's survivorship bias. We only see the winners, the successes, the companies that made it big. We don't see all the failures, the ones that didn't make it.
Exactly. It's like that idea of the cemetery of letters. All those unpublished manuscripts, the books that never saw the light of day.
Right. Maybe they were just as good as the books that became famous, maybe even better. But we'll never know.
It's a huge blind spot.
It is. And it's especially relevant in those winner-take-all environments we talked about earlier, like in Extremistan.
Right. Think about the world of authors again. We see the tiny handful of best-selling authors. Those are the ones who become part of the literary heritage.
Right.
But we have absolutely no idea how many other talented writers are out there who just never got that lucky break. Taleb jokes that they're probably all working at Starbucks.
Yeah, making lattes instead of writing novels.
Right. Our whole perception of literary talent is skewed because we're only looking at the winners.
We're missing the bigger picture. And it's not just about recognizing talent, it's about understanding the consequences of actions. Taleb brings up an economist named Frederick Bastiat, who talked about the importance of focusing on unseen consequences.
Yeah, what didn't happen?
Right. We tend to focus on the immediate, visible effects of something. But the longer-term, less obvious consequences, those can be way more important.
For sure. And Taleb gives the example of Ralph Nader, the consumer advocate who exposed safety flaws in cars. He arguably saved countless lives, but he rarely gets the same recognition as someone who, say, invents a new gadget.
It's easier to celebrate its success than an averted disaster.
Right, and that's a big part of silent evidence for you to grasp.
Okay.
It's the invisibility of averted disasters. Taleb uses this great analogy of Giacomo Casanova, this infamous adventurer. He was known for having this Teflon-style protection. He survived all kinds of risky situations, duels, seductions, you name it.
He was a lucky guy.
Yeah, but because he survived all that, he might have underestimated the actual danger he was in. And it's the same with successful cities like Rome, Athens. They've been around for centuries. They've survived wars, plagues, all kinds of disasters.
They're like little Casanovas.
Exactly. But that survival, it doesn't mean they were inherently less vulnerable to those risks. It just means they got lucky.
So their survival could create a false sense of security.
Absolutely. A failure to see all the cities that didn't make it. So we've talked about our struggles with randomness, our love of narratives, and this tricky problem of silent evidence. Now let's get into another area that really affects how we see the world.
Yay.
Epistemic arrogance and the illusion of control.
Okay. Epistemic arrogance. It sounds a bit pretentious.
It does, doesn't it?
What exactly does it mean?
It basically means being overconfident in what we know.
Like we think we're smarter than we actually are.
Yeah, we overestimate our knowledge. Taleb talks about this experiment where people were asked to give ranges for uncertain facts, things like the population of a city or the length of a river.
Okay.
And they consistently underestimated their margin of error. Like they were way too confident in their answers.
So we walk around thinking we have a much better grasp on things than we really do.
Yeah, and here's the thing. More information doesn't always fix this. Sometimes it makes it worse.
How's that?
Taleb talks about how being bombarded with information can actually make us focus on the noise, on random fluctuations, and mistake those for real patterns or knowledge.
We get lost in the weeds.
Exactly. He describes this experiment with a fire hydrant.
Okay.
The closer you look at the water coming out of the fire hydrant, at the individual droplets, the more random it seems. You lose sight of the overall flow, the fact that it's coming from a single source.
So the more we zoom in, the more we miss the bigger picture.
Yeah. And he also makes the point that watching the news every hour might actually be worse for your understanding than reading a weekly magazine.
Because you get all those little fluctuations, all that noise.
Right. The longer time frame allows for some of that noise to settle down.
This is a big problem, especially for experts, right? Taleb talks about the tunneling effect.
Yes, the tunneling effect. Experts can get so focused on their narrow area of expertise that they miss big risks that are outside their field. They're so deep in the details that they can't see the forest for the trees.
Like they have blinders on.
Yeah, and Taleb talks about Philip Tetlock's research, where he studied the accuracy of expert predictions. And you know what? Experts were terrible at making long-term predictions.
Molly.
Yeah. And what's worse, they would come up with all these explanations for why they got it wrong, which only reinforce their own belief in their expertise.
So it's like a self-perpetuating cycle. The experts are wrong, but they don't realize it, so they keep making bad predictions.
It's a bit of a mess. But the key takeaway for you here is this. A little humility goes a long way.
Right. We need to acknowledge what we don't know. Okay, so we've talked about epistemic arrogance. Now let's move on to the ludic fallacy. This is another one of Taleb's big ideas, and it's about the way we think about randomness.
The ludic fallacy, it's a good one.
So as I understand it, the ludic fallacy is basically this. We take the kind of neat, predictable randomness we see in games, like in a casino, and we try to apply that to the real world.
Right. The real world is a lot messier than a casino.
Exactly. In a casino, the rules are clear, the odds are known, you flip a coin, it's 50-50. But real life, it throws curveballs all the time.
Taleb contrasts these two mindsets, the casino mindset versus the real world mindset.
Right, he talks about Dr. John and Fat Tony.
Yeah. Dr. John is your typical actuary, very focused on textbook probability, statistical models. Fat Tony, on the other hand, he's street smart, suspicious of those simple assumptions.
So how do they approach something like, I don't know, flipping a coin?
Well, Dr. John, he'd say it's 50-50, simple as that. But Fat Tony, he'd want to know who's flipping the coin, what kind of coin it is, if it's weighted. He'd be looking for all those little details that could affect the outcome. He wouldn't just take the textbook answer at face value.
So Fat Tony has a more realistic view of randomness.
He does. And Taleb mentions this interesting thing. He was at a think tank in a casino, and he noticed that military personnel often had a more sophisticated understanding of randomness than academics or executives.
Why is that?
Maybe it's because they deal with high-stakes situations all the time. They've seen how unpredictable things can be, how even the best-laid plans can fall apart.
And Taleb uses a really striking example to show how those real-world black swans, they can completely blindside us. The Siegfried and Roy tiger attack.
Yeah, that was a shocker.
Nobody, not even the casino's risk assessment team, had considered the possibility of the tiger turning on its trainer. It was completely outside their model.
That's the thing with Black Swans. They force us to confront the limits of our understanding. They show us how much we don't know.
Okay, so if we can't really predict these black swan events, what's the best way to deal with them? Taleb talks about looking for bird poop, which I think is his way of saying we need to be open to serendipity, to those unexpected positive occurrences. How do you create an environment, in your life or in your work where you're more likely to stumble across these fortunate accidents? And importantly, how do you make sure you actually recognize them when they happen?
Well, Taleb draws on the work of Karl Popper, a philosopher of science. And Popper argued that the biggest breakthroughs, the most important scientific discoveries, they're often the least predictable. They come out of left field. And he points to Arthur Koestler's book, The Sleepwalkers, which talks about how major scientific figures like Copernicus and Darwin, they often stumbled upon their discoveries without fully realizing their importance at the time. Like their ideas were so revolutionary that they weren't immediately accepted or even understood.
So it's not just about being lucky, it's about being open to the unexpected.
Right. You need to have a mindset that's receptive to information that doesn't fit your existing models, to those events that challenge your assumptions. And Taleb gives the example of Viagra. It was originally developed for a completely different purpose, and then bam, a totally unexpected beneficial outcome.
It's a classic example of serendipity. And he also mentions those hair growth medications. Same thing. Developed for something else, ended up having this unintended but positive side effect.
It highlights the power of chance, the fact that sometimes the best discoveries are the ones we weren't even looking for.
Right. It's about exploiting those unforeseen corners, as Taleb's friend Bruce Goldberg calls them.
Exactly. So many people are focused on avoiding negative unintended consequences. But the people who thrive in a world of black swans, they're also looking for those positive surprises.
Okay, let's talk about one of the most controversial aspects of Taleb's work.
Yeah.
His critique of the bell curve, the Gaussian distribution. He calls it a great intellectual fraud.
Oh, yeah. He really goes after it.
Why is he so against the bell curve?
So Taleb's main argument is this. The bell curve might be useful in Mediocristan, where things are relatively predictable, but it totally breaks down in Extremistan.
Okay.
He contrasts things like income distribution with book sales. In income distribution, yeah, there are rich people and poor people, but the extremes, they're still within a certain range. But book sales, you have a handful of mega bestsellers that totally dominate everything else.
Right.
It's this extreme asymmetry, this fat tail that the bell curve just can't capture.
So the bell curve smooths everything out.
Exactly. It assumes that those extreme events are super rare. But in Extremistan, those rare events, they're the ones that matter most. They drive the biggest changes.
So we're underestimating their importance if we're using the bell curve.
Exactly. And the further out you go on the tail of the bell curve, the bigger the potential for error. Those rare events were really bad at estimating their probability. And on top of that, the way we use averages in the bell curve model, it actually dilutes the impact of those single extreme events.
We're averaging away the things that are most important.
Right. And Taleb reminds us that the original name for the bell curve was the law of errors.
The law of errors. Interesting.
Yeah. Deviations from the average were seen as mistakes. But in a world of black swans, those so-called errors, they're often the most consequential events. He says that other models, like rich get richer dynamics, they're often more accurate for explaining things in Extremistan.
So if the bell curve isn't the right tool, what is? Taleb talks about Mandelbrottian randomness or fractal randomness.
Right.
What's the big idea there?
Fractal randomness, it basically says that those big deviations, they're not just possible, they're expected. They're part of the system. And a key feature of fractals is this idea of self-affinity.
Self-affinity.
Yeah. You see similar patterns at different scales. Like, think about the coastline of Britain. It's jagged and irregular.
Okay.
But if you zoom in on a small section, it still has that same jaggedness.
The pattern repeats itself.
Exactly. And this connects to the idea of power law distributions, where those extreme events, they're not just rare, they're way more likely than they would be in a bell curve world.
So the tail of the distribution is fat.
It is. And here's the tricky thing. Sometimes a system that follows a fractal pattern can look like it follows a bell curve if you haven't seen enough data.
Okay.
Like if those big events haven't happened yet in your observation period, you might think the system is more stable than it really is. Taleb talks about a water puddle. You see the puddle, but you don't know how many different ice cubes might have melted to create it.
Right. You're missing the history.
You are. You can't work backward from the puddle to figure out how big those ice cubes were. And he points to the work of researchers like Buchanan, Ball, and Ormerod, who've shown that power law distributions are actually pretty common in social science.
So Extremistan might be more prevalent than we think.
It might be. And here's the problem. Our standard statistical education, it's all about those Mediocristan tools, the bell curve, the central limit theorem.
Right.
We're not taught how to deal with the uncertainty of Extremistan. It's like Taleb says, developing medicine for plants and then trying to use it on humans.
Completely different systems.
Exactly. And he highlights this with stock market returns. If you take out the 10 biggest one-day moves in the past 50 years, the overall returns look completely different.
Those big swings, those errors, they actually make a huge difference.
They do. And Taleb talks about how people trained in those traditional Gaussian methods, they really struggle when they encounter black swans in the real world. He even describes some hostile reactions he got from academics who were really invested in those bell curve models.
It's a clash of worldviews.
It is. Taleb is a skeptical empiricist. He's wary of those grand universal models.
So what's the takeaway here? What should we do if we can't really predict these black swans?
Well, Taleb's message is this. Stop trying to predict the unpredictable, especially in Extremistan. Focus on building robust systems, strategies that can handle those big shocks.
So be prepared, not predictive.
Exactly. And he finishes this part of the book by talking about the uncertainty of the phony.
Okay, this is a new one.
It's about how even the people whose job it is to deal with uncertainty, like some philosophers or financial experts, they can fall into the trap of oversimplification. He gives the example of a philosopher who had PhDs in both philosophy and finance, a super smart guy.
Right.
But he kept teaching these Gaussian-based financial models, even though they clearly didn't account for black swans. It's like he had two separate compartments in his brain and they weren't talking to each other.
So he was missing the bigger picture.
He was. And Taleb's point is this. The key to dealing with black swans is not to try to predict them, but to focus on not being a sucker.
Don't be the sucker. I like that. So what's the bottom line here for us?
Here's the thing for you, the listener. Black swans, they're unpredictable, but they have a huge impact. We're wired to create stories, to look for patterns, but we often underestimate how much randomness is really at play.
We need to get more comfortable with uncertainty.
We do. We need to be prepared for the unexpected.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. Black swans, they really force you to rethink how you see the world.
They do. And they leave you with some questions to ponder. What areas of your life might be vulnerable to black swans? What are you overlooking? What are those unread books that might hold the key to understanding the unexpected?
It's a great question, and it's one we all need to ask ourselves.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into black swans. We encourage you to explore Taleb's work further and to cultivate a mindset that's both skeptical and open to the unexpected.
Well said.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.